it's creepy. Yes, before.
And welcome back to the X Zone, everyone. My name is Rob McConnell. We're coming to you live and around the world from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Worldwide toll-free 800-610-7035. Email xzone@xzoneradiotv.com. On all social media sites, X-Zone Radio TV, and our main website, where you can listen to the X-Zone 724-365 is www.xzoneradiotv.com. My guest this hour is Robert Veach, and he has over 25 years' experience as an electrical and mechanical engineer and has a passion for ghost hunting, animatronics, and video production. His Jefferson Graveyard Show has been covered on NBC, CBS, ABC, and WGN-TV News, as well as various Chicago newspapers. Vparanormal is a Chicago area paranormal investigation group fueled by passion and dedication to taking paranormal science to a higher level of credibility. Joining me now is the V behind Vparanormal, Robert Veach. Their website is www.vparanormal.com. And Robert, welcome to the X-Zone.
Oh, how you doing, Bob?
I'm doing pretty good for an old guy. How about yourself? How are things in Chicago?
Pretty good. It's warmed up a little bit, so that's always a good sign.
So you say it's warmed up, so it's about minus 30 degrees, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, it got up to 50, so that's pretty good.
Well, good for you guys. It's still blooming cold here at this part of the Great Lakes. But listen, Robert, I have to ask you, how did you get involved in the paranormal?
Well, that's a good question. I've always been interested in paranormal for many years, and about 4.5 years ago, I was taking some pictures at my aunt's house, and my son was in one of the pictures. There was a really unique-looking image that was kind of behind him, and to this day I can't explain it, and it was kind of after the death of one of my relatives. So that kind of triggered my interest and piqued it up, and so I started watching a lot of the shows on television, and was getting a little frustrated with how they were using equipment. But, I've always been into the paranormal, but about 4.5 years ago, I formed Vparanormal.
What are some of the unique research devices that you have invented specifically for investigating the paranormal?
Well, there's a lot of different things on my website that are under the technical section. I've always had an interest in gadgets and technical devices. My background's in engineering, so I've always wanted to take things apart from a really young age. So I started taking apart a lot of the devices that paranormal researchers use, a lot of the typical things like the K2 meters, the MEL meters, things like that, and full spectrum cameras and so forth. So I started to modify these things and make kind of unique devices with the whole goal is to really try and prove that there's anything really paranormal going on out there. So the list is pretty extensive. It kind of goes, some of them are optical devices that allow us to see shadow figures. Some of them are audio devices that modify anybody's voice to be at a certain, certain uniqueness that's heard by the other side, theoretically. And some of them are things that work with ghost boxes and other things like that. There's a whole slew of things that I'm experimenting with, and my whole goal is just to try and prove whether this is real or not.
Based on the work that you've done so far during your paranormal investigations, where do you feel that paranormal research is heading?
Well, it's a good question. I think that the technology that is out there right now is pretty impressive. It's a recent phenomena that we have these full spectrum cameras, and that we have these digital recorders that are so quiet, and they're really not affected by environmental noise and electromagnetic fields like the older recorders were. So I think that that the technology is driving this forward. That's why you're seeing all these shows. You're seeing everybody having these new devices and these new gadgets, because it's relatively inexpensive to get involved with this now, and you really have some really high-tech devices that are available.
Do you really think that a lot of these shows on TV are credible? Now, I know that they're called reality shows, but I also know a number of the producers, directors, and when you get them away from the set, like, these shows are anything but reality. How can you and your equipment and the way that you conduct yourself and your background change this image to the better, I mean?
Well, I recently was on a national show called Ghost Asylum.
Yeah.
And it was a very interesting experience because I was able to bring a few of my devices that are really relatively big devices and really high-tech. Some of them are optical, and other ones are auditory devices. And I have a whole lab that really sits on somebody's shoulder as you walk around. It's called a Para-Lab. So when I was on this show, it was fascinating because I saw my devices triggering like crazy, and I just saw everything working like I was hoping it to work. But what happens on these shows is that they have to edit them out into a really short amount of time, and they have to kind of produce what's interesting for the audience. So unfortunately, a lot of the things get edited out. A lot of the things that was captured by my equipment never made it to the actual show. But what's shown is that some of my devices actually successfully worked, like the Parashadow, for instance, actually captured an image of two of the people that had died in this building. We were in this Bisman building. So, these paranormal shows, I don't know if they help or hurt the field. I think overall they help the field because what they do is they generate a lot of interest. So people see these shows, they see the devices, they say, you know what, I want to buy this device, so they support the whole industry.
Yeah, I understand they support the whole industry, but, it's just like, in my opinion, it's like giving a toy to somebody who wants to do something on the spur of the moment, because in actuality, they don't know what the hell they're doing, and sooner or later, the toy goes and sits on the top shelf, whether the toy is, bought at Walmart or one of these drones that cost over $2,000 with a high definition TV camera in it.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a lot of people that get involved with this after thinking it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And they do see these paranormal TV shows, and they think, well, that's pretty scary and that's fun. But the reality is, as you're aware, is it's mostly you're waiting for things to happen, and you're spending so much time in the dark, and usually you don't get much of anything. And then the post-analysis, it takes just months of evidence review of all the cameras and audio. So I think you're right about that. A lot of people think it's all fun, and then they buy this equipment, and then it just sits on the shelf because they don't realize how much is involved in really capturing something.
That's right. And like you were saying, the amount of editing that goes on. The producers do have to edit it down to either 22 minutes or 24 minutes for a half-hour show to allow for commercial content. And if the show doesn't pique interest, if it doesn't create numbers, there's no advertisers, and that means the network is not going to renew the show, or they may just decide to drop it after a few episodes. So there's a lot that goes into it. And when the person's sitting at home watching the TV, watching the edited master, the broadcast quality, the broadcast edition, they're seeing a finely put together piece of TV show production. And I don't think they realize the work that goes behind by credible investigators and researchers like yourself into making what is just 22 minutes out of maybe, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 a day, 2 days worth of video.
Exactly. It's an incredible amount of evidence review for these television shows. And, I put together a 20-minute video recently, and I was probably analyzing the data for 45 days on and off, part-time, and some days it was 12 hours a day. Because that's just the ratio of how much time you got to spend to capture something, because evidence is really difficult to get. And you're exactly right. These shows have to entertain people, and some of them are kind of scripted, some of them are lightly scripted, but it's a fine-tuned machine. And what I really enjoyed was that they had somebody like myself, more of a technical person, on this television show, and I hope I brought some credibility to it, and they did capture some really cool things, so that's another good thing.
Well, you know, credibility is everything in this game, and to see somebody with your background taking a serious look at it, it makes me feel good. It makes me feel as if there is hope for the industry as well as for the research that is going forward. Tell me about the most interesting case that you've worked on.
Recently, I was at a home in a town, Naperville, Illinois, and there was a family there that had some paranormal activity, and it's still going on probably to this day. And I brought one of my devices there, and it's a new device. You had on Laura, and she was talking about frequencies.
Yes.
And it's very interesting what she was talking about, because I kind of invented a device that uses light frequencies and allows an entity to change those frequencies at will. And so we brought this to this home, and we captured a shadow that moved into the frame, and at the same time we got a hit on the K2 meter. So I have this camera going, and I allow entities to present themselves and to see what they look like. It's kind of like a mirror into what they look like.
Sure.
And they can theoretically see themselves. But the key thing is they could change the frequency, and I think there's something to what all these psychics like Laura are talking about. There's something unique about light frequencies and the frequencies that somebody like Laura is tuning into.
Could this also have anything to do with the theory that of the multidimensional aspect of existence, that as they go from one dimension to the next, their frequencies change in order to transcend or transcend into the next frequency or the next dimension?
Yeah, I think there is something to that, because this is a new device, and it's as infancy right now, and I'm actually constantly updating it. But I expect to get some really unique results when I bring it to the right location. But I think that's exactly it. I think that there's something going on, and they control these parameters somehow, and one of them is frequency, and it's constantly changing for them, and who knows why. But they're creating these changes in frequency, they're creating these slight electromagnetic fields, they're creating slight charge variations, which then turn into magnetic fields, and that's what I'm trying to hope that this device will do. It'll allow them to pick a frequency, a light frequency, that allows us to see them. And it's kind of like a mirror. They're looking into a mirror themselves. It's an HD camera pointing at their face.
Right.
And hopefully they can manipulate this device through environmental changes, just like we talked about frequencies. They can manipulate this through a K2 meter, a MEL meter, EMF changes, temperature changes, and hopefully we'll capture something really unique and we'll present it.
It's almost as if they go through a vibrational wormhole.
Yep.
Yeah.
It sure seems that way. I wish we all had an answer for all this, because it's the hardest thing to capture evidence and to explain what's going on when you actually capture it, because a lot of environmental things that will corrupt evidence, audio-wise, and so it's always a fine line for what you present and what you actually gather, and making sure that it looks as credible evidence.
Robert, why is it so difficult for researchers like yourself to get the actual paranormal evidence?
Well, to me it doesn't seem like it's that difficult overall, as long as you're willing to spend 12 to 15 hours in the dark with thousands of pieces of equipment.
Yeah.
I think statistically, it's kind of like, there was recently a type of lightning that was spherical lightning that they'd never physically seen or captured on video. And they knew that this lightning existed based on mathematics of the charge and of the clouds and the density changes. And all of a sudden, they captured this finally. Now, this has been happening, who knows, millions of years probably. And all of a sudden they capture it. I think it was 5-6 years ago. So I think paranormal is the same kind of thing. These things are happening around us all the time, but they happen so quickly and so randomly. I'll give you a good example. I was at an investigation, and I came home, and this was a local investigation at a senior's home. And I actually started seeing shadows moving in my house, and I can tell you I've never experienced that before in my entire life. And my wife started seeing them too, and she's a pretty skeptical person about this. So does that mean that I'm able to capture something like that? I'll tell you, I set up all my equipment for a week, and I didn't capture one thing, because it's the hardest thing is to capture a random event. It's like you have all this equipment set up. You have to have cameras going 24/7. You have to have digital recorders at every spot in a house and wired microphones, and just statistically, it's very, very difficult. So when you do finally get something, you're ecstatic about it, and you always have to balance it out, make sure that you're not being fooled, and use certain analysis on the evidence you get before you present it.
Well, can you tell us about ghost boxes? How ghost boxes work? And maybe you can explain to our listeners what a ghost box is.
Certainly. Probably in the 70s, there was a gentleman, and I always forget his name, but he started experimenting with some AM radios and some FM radios. And he was a ham operator. He knew what he was doing, and he started to sweep the radio band. So imagine you have an AM radio or an FM radio, and you have one of the older ones, and I'm sure the younger listeners are thinking, I don't know what he's talking about, but the older radios had a mechanical dial. And you would turn that dial when you want to change the station. And, of course, it was static in there, and then all of a sudden it would tune in and you would get the station. Well, he started to vary that thing very quickly by hand, and he started to hear voices coming in. So that was the start of the ghost box. Mm-hmm. But the modern ghost box today uses a digital radio, and instead of it sitting on one frequency, like FM 109 or 108, it moves along and it changes digitally very rapidly, 100 milliseconds, a tenth of a second to a half of a second, and it literally changes channels. And it sounds like gibberish. It sounds like you're getting a little part of every radio station. And that's the whole goal of the ghost box, is to scan so fast that it is all gibberish. And then if you all of a sudden get a response from something in the environment that is more than 1/10 of a syllable, then you know that something's going on, because there's no way that you're going to get 4 or 5 radio stations saying something in the sequence that makes any sense. So all of a sudden you have a word like hello, or I'm dead, or goodbye, or a name. And if you're changing channels at a tenth of a second a channel, that's pretty compelling, because no radio station is going to put together a person's name with the word hello that rapidly. So
it sounds like a ghost box is another version of a multi-band scanner, like the old Bearcat scanners, that would just scan frequencies and stop momentarily if there was some traffic on that frequency. So how do you decide what frequency to start at and finish at in order to make sure that you don't pick up frequencies or channels that are being used commercially or for private use?
That's a good point. And these things work on the FM band with the music. And, you could be broadcasting right now. The X zone could be on a station and broadcasting in the air. And you would pick it up in a ghost box. So the way to avoid the contamination is to lower the antenna or to remove the antenna. I have the antennas removed in all my ghost boxes. But what happens is you do get contamination of a radio station. So a lot of times you'll hear little snippets of sound. But you get really good at listening, and you hear these snippets of sound which don't make any sense, then all of a sudden you get something that's contiguous. And I'll give you an example, Rob. I had the ghost box at an investigation, and the person's name was Trump. It had nothing to do with Donald Trump. And this guy was called Trump. It was short for Trumper. And we kept saying, can you say some entity was driving this guy crazy in his home, and we kept saying, can you say his name? Well, there's several times where it said the name Trump, and if you analyze the audio, you can see that no radio station is going to put together the T, the R, the U, the M, and P. So that's really compelling, and we actually had the antenna removed, and we said, you're playing music into this person's ears, so you're driving them crazy. If you're so powerful, can you play music in our ears? And we captured a whole song that was contiguous, even though the radio was scanning at a tenth of a second. So, you can get some compelling evidence from a ghost spot. You just have to understand its limitations and not be fooled when you get a radio station coming in. Because it's just like you said, it's like a scanner.
Right.
And it's scanning really fast, but it doesn't stop. It scans and it just keeps looping around on the FM band or the AM band.
All right. You and I have to take a short commercial break. Robert, thanks so much for coming on. Very interesting talk. When we come back, I'd like to talk to you about EVPs and what you anticipate that some of your wonderful inventions that are on your website. I loved spending time on your site today.
Thanks.
Yeah, and how you see the progression of research into this wonderful field. People call it paranormal. I call it normal. Robert Veach is our special guest, X-Zone Nation, www.vparanormal.com. That's www.vparanormal.com. And we'll both be back on the other side of this commercial break with the news as the X-Zone continues live and around the world from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. My name is Rob McConnell. Don't go away. My guest this hour is Robert Veach. He is the brains. He is the driving force behind Vparanormal.com. They're based in Chicago, and Robert is a former mechanical engineer who has invented several new pieces of technology specifically to investigate the paranormal. Once again, visit his website. It's a fascinating site, plenty to read, plenty to learn at www.vparanormal.com. Again, Robert, thanks very much for joining us. But I started talking about EVPs, and is there a difference between an EVP that is recorded on analog recording devices and an EVP that is recorded digitally?
Well, that's a really good question. There is a difference in the way that the EVP is possibly coming into the device. An analog recorder is usually a physical medium. It's a polymer, a plastic material that has iron oxide on it, and it can be magnetized on and off. And whereas a digital recorder is ones and zeros being stored into a memory device. But the thing that makes them really the same is that EVPs typically don't even use the microphone. They actually bypass the microphone as a very unique magnetic field. So in a sense, the old recorders were very similar to the new digital recorders because a lot of times you can even remove the microphone and still get an EVP. Because I feel that EVPs are being presented to our device by a very minute electromagnetic pulsar a signal that is bypassing the microphones themselves. That's why you don't hear it in the environment. That's why it's always in post that you all of a sudden get these EVPs or these electronic voice phenomena going on, because they're really not there. They're not moving the air molecules. They're not vibrating your eardrums. There's something beyond that. They're electromagnetic or moving charge that's going into your device.
In the olden days of radio, we used to have to keep logger tapes. Every 24 hours, actually it was every 12 hours, there was one machine that would click to the next, and we had to keep the logger tapes for the CRTC as well as they do down in the States for the FCC. And after the period of time that was allotted in that area where we had to keep the tape, after that time had passed, I think it was 30 days or 45 days, we would take that tape and bring it to a bulk eraser and you'd put the reel on the electromagnetic plate, hit it, and you'd move it around to erase what was on that tape. But what we found out many times is that we didn't totally erase the tape, and there would be bleed over from the previous play. And I often wonder if this is happening within the EVP community when it comes to the old analog system, or the little analog cassettes that would take these little audio cassettes.
That's interesting. The bleed over, probably when you're listening to the bleed over, it was probably going backwards. It probably freaked you out if it was a tape that you would flip around. I don't know what it was. But, that bleed over is similar in a way to an EVP because the bleed over is a minute signal that is left on that iron oxide. And an EVP is always in the mud. It's very, very low. So those probably sounded like EVPs, but they were probably, the leftover remnants of the magnetic field that was on that iron oxide. But today's digital recorders are great because they have shielding in them. They don't allow external signals to go in. You can take a digital recorder today, you can take a family radio, walkie-talkie, whatever, and you can go right next to it, and you won't hear anything on there. Now, you do the same thing with a reel-to-reel or a cassette recorder. For what you're referring to, you would probably get some bleed over into there. So when you get something today, a lot of skeptics say, it's just noise, it's something in the environment. I can tell you right now, if I had a C-Beer a truck outside my window and he was on the radio talking, I wouldn't get anything on my digital recorder because I've tested that. So,
excellent. That's good. That's good to know. How do full spectrum cameras work?
Well, every camera that's been around for the last probably 15, 20 years have sensors in them. And the sensors have changed over the years. And the sensors are what pick up the photons or the light that comes through the lens. And, the older camcorders use a certain type of sensor. The newer ones use more sensitive ones that are CMOS, it's called. And all the cameras that have ever been around, they work by measuring the light and they go across an array of electronics that sense the photons. Well, every camera that is in existence, they purposely block the light that's called infrared or ultraviolet, but they keep the white spectrum. Just like our eyes, we only see the white spectrum. We don't see infrared or ultraviolet on the far left or the far right of the spectrum. So all these cameras, the full spectrum ones, you kind of take that filter out of there and you let all the light hit the sensor. And what that does, that makes it see the infrared and the ultraviolet as well as the white light. So basically any camera that you have, that I have, even a cell phone camera, you can take apart and you can remove what's called that hot filter. And then all of a sudden that sensor no longer has sunglasses in front of it, and it will allow it to see the full spectrum that it was designed to, which includes infrared and ultraviolet.
Let me ask you this. Who do you feel is really doing the communication during an investigation? Well,
that's a good question. Again, I wish I had the answer, really. I have a feeling that, just like the spirit communicators like Laurie had on, they sense or they feel things, and some of them actually see something going on. I work with a sensitive that's very similar to Laura, and I worked with her a couple times on some investigations. Her name is Amy Bianc, and she is a sensitive, and she could sense things. And after working with her, I kind of feel that there's something going on in certain select environments, and it's almost like there's an entity that is in this environment that is trying to communicate to you for some reason. And the whole mystery is, why are they communicating, and is it residual, like what is actually going on? But after working with a sensitive, like your guest Laura,
right,
I kind of feel that this is real, that there's something going on, and we just have to get the right equipment and the right people together to capture something that is more phenomenal that skeptics can't say doesn't exist. Because after doing this, I'm a skeptic at heart,
Right.
and I make all this equipment to try and prove that this is real. And I can tell you, after doing this for almost 5 years now, there's definitely something going on that is triggering my devices and other people's devices. And I really don't know what it is, but there's something paranormal going on. There's no question about it at this point. I'm no longer at the point where I'm saying, that doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
I'm at the point now saying it exists, and I'm going to prove it using my equipment.
I don't think that I wouldn't call you a skeptic. What I would call you is a seeker of truth, a scientist, because that's what a scientist does. Exactly what you're doing. So skeptics, I've known many skeptics in my life, and I've had them on the show, and they do not approach a situation like you do. They won't take any other point of view. They will not try to prove their point. They just blah 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 blah. That's my proof. But I admire the way that you and your team go at it, and I'm sure that we'll be hearing more about you and your team in the future.
I sure hope so. I'm going to keep moving forward, and I'm going to keep developing things, and maybe on other television shows, and try and show what's going on and what I've developed.
Right.
And really, my overall goal is to be able to communicate at will to whatever is in an environment.
Mm-hmm.
And I have some devices that are even called Paratalk that are unique. And as we're talking right now, it would change my voice and your voice and do something to it that I feel is closer to what they can understand. So my goal is to really open up a portal that proves scientifically that something is going on, and not just take somebody's word, but actually prove it by using these devices.
So basically, what if I understand what you're saying about this Paratalk? It's something like the Universal Translation Code, Universal Translation System that the Starship Enterprise would have used.
That's exactly right. I actually had access to that.
Really?
On the television show. Yeah.
You're kidding.
No, I wish I did, but it kind of looks like that. Actually, what it is it's pretty simple overall, but most people that do paranormal work, they kind of have this gut feeling that if whatever entity is in an environment is creating a charge or electromagnetic field, that's triggering these devices like the K2 meter and the millimeters.
Right.
So the ghost box we talked about, Rob, where we talked about it changing frequencies really rapidly and making gibberish, what I do is I take my voice or anybody's voice that talks into the microphone, and I send them gibberish back. I actually scan the FM radio band really rapidly,
right,
and I send them a composite signal of my voice. And at the same time I do that, I send them an electromagnetic version of my voice too, which is very similar to if you were to be broadcasting on the FM band or AM band, and you were by an antenna. That's a version of your voice going out as an electromagnetic field.
Right.
So I made that device, and the first time I used it, I got a phenomenal response. I was in a basement in Oswego, Illinois, that was haunted, according to the owners, and I believe it was too at this point. And I was getting nothing in this basement because the basement was so deep down, and it had all this thick limestone that the antenna was picking up nothing whatsoever. So I said, you know what, I'm going to try the Paratalk. So I said, I'm getting kind of bored down here, and if there's anybody here, I haven't heard anything for 40 minutes on this radio. Can you just say hello to me? And you hear the radio going, then you hear hello, and that was pretty neat. So that's from that point on, I really started using the Paratalk. In fact, on that show, Ghost Asylum, if you look closely, you'll see a boom microphone on the person holding the device, and he wasn't aware of it, but everything he was saying was going into the air as a unique signal. So if anything was in that building, that basement building, they were hearing it.
Interesting, very interesting. Like you're putting the science back into paranormal.
I like to think so.
Yeah.
There's when you look at the devices, like somebody like Gary Galka and Bill Chappell, they're engineers too. And they've really done some amazing things to bring technology forward. I'm kind of doing the same thing, and I'm kind of thinking out of the box, and I'm doing some optical things as well as electromagnetic and circuit things. And I'm just trying to really try and prove that there is something going on and that I could eventually validate it, and no skeptic will say, boy, that's not real. They'll say, okay, something's going on, we need to do further research into this.
How should investigators, or what could investigators, paranormal researchers or paranormal investigators do to improve the images that they have to the public? Like what can they do? How can they clean them up? How should they present them?
Well, some teams, I think there's a lot of teams out there, probably in the thousands, and some people get into it for the wrong reasons. They might charge money to investigate. You shouldn't be paying any money for an investigation. That's not the way they do it. A good team never charges any money. They try and gather evidence and try and help you. But I think because of these shows, because of television, I think that the image of the investigator has probably gotten clarified and cleared up in some ways, because most people didn't know anything about it. And now you can go to the average person and you could say, do you know what a millimeter is or a K2 meter? They actually have an idea now. So I think investigators just need to do what they're doing, to do these investigations and to not charge for them, and to present the evidence as best they can. If they can, make a video of it, make the evidence available to the public, which is what I always do, and then people will feel more comfortable, and you'll start to get more cases. The public will then not feel that this is all crazy stuff. They'll think that this is real science-based.
And like I said, this is what the paranormal community has needed from day one, and thank God you and your team are actually doing it. Hats off to you, pal.
Oh, there's no problem. Thanks for that compliment.
One final question. How can researchers or investigators use computer software to clean up the EVPs that we talked about before? Can they, or should they just leave them as they record them?
Well, that's another good question, Rob. The EVPs that we typically get are really unclear, and they're really, really low level compared to the audio. Mm-hmm. So, if you're in an environment and you have it really quiet, which you should try and do, and when you ask questions in an environment, you should always have a nice long pause in there so that there's a silence period, because they're so hard to hear, these EVPs, because they're kind of in the mud. So there's various pieces of software. There's Adobe Audition. There's a free Audacity out there. And what you could do is you could bring what you think is an EVP. It's a little section of your audio. You ask a question and say, is anybody here in this environment? And all of a sudden you get this very low answer to that. And what you could do with that software is you can enhance it. You could just raise the volume of it. And of course you can get fancy. You could put filters on there, and you can try and clean it up. But you have to be really careful with that, because the more you clean it up, the more you create artifacts. And of course, artifacts will make it harder to hear the EVP. So sometimes the best thing to do is to just raise the volume on the EVP and present it to the public and let them hear. Because most of the EVPs are classified three ways, where nobody's going to understand it, or about half the people, or everybody will understand it. But most of them are the ones that are really the Class C, that are really hard to understand. So just use this software and just amplify it up a little bit. And if you want to be sophisticated, do some filtering technique on it to make it a little bit clearer. But one thing that you'll know when you have a recording going, you'll know when you capture an EVP, because you'll be listening with headphones, and you'll ask a question, or somebody will be speaking in the room, and you'll hear this very strange, fast-speaking set of syllables that doesn't sound like anybody in the room. And a lot of times I have mics on everybody, so I have a voice signature of what they sound like.
Right.
So you know when you get an EVP. And another thing is, EVPs that come in, this phenomena, they usually come in right in the middle of the stereo field. They don't come to the left or to the right. It's not like I got a stereo microphone and somebody in my right saying, hey, buddy, I'm a spirit. It's usually usually right in the center, and it's in the field. So you can't be fooled because it's going to be right smack in the middle. Kind of like where the drums are in the song. They're always in the middle.
Yeah.
The EVPs are going to be there, too.
Robert, the time has come for now where I must say so long to you. Congratulations on the great work you're doing. Congratulations on your team. And I would love to have you back on in the future.
I would love to be back on the show. This is great, Rob. I appreciate the opportunity.
Hey, listen, if there's anything we can do to help you, you just give me a call. You've got my contact information.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Appreciate it.
Robert, take care of yourself. And Exonation, Robert Veach has been our special guest this hour. Do yourself a favor. If you know any paranormal researchers, ghost hunters, whoever who has interest or wants to become a bona fide researcher, and they're looking for equipment, send them to www.vparanormal.com. That's www.vparanormal.com. I'm telling you, I was at the site today, spent time there, and it's just amazing stuff. It's about time that people, and I'm glad that Robert and his team are doing this, engineers, scientists, software people are actually getting together, creating the equipment that will finally, hopefully, end this mystery once and for all. Just imagine being able to pick up a little device and talk to someone on the other side who has passed on. Now, that is something that Apple can't do. We'll be back on the other side of this break as we continue here in the X-Zone from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Once again, Robert Veach has been my guest this hour. His website, www.vparanormal.com. That's the alphabet V, paranormal.com. Oh, I'm telling you, these are wonderful times. The truth is out there. And I want to believe. I really want to believe. But I also want to see the evidence to substantiate the claims. And I believe, based on what I heard over this past hour, that the truth is not that far away. I'll be back. Don't go away.